Thank you very much for coming out this evening to the Garlands and our program for the Barrington Area Library. This is the first in the series of Community Conversations. Community Conversations is designed to introduce you to the many facets of the local Barrington population. So we'll be interviewing monthly patrons, or I shouldn't say patrons, but people from all walks of life. Even we may interview you as a man on the street. So this is a way to get to meet your neighbors, to meet and greet your neighbors. We're very proud to have for our very first speaker, Wendy Paulson, who has spent many years promoting conservation, and as many of you know, probably have taken walks with Wendy through the woods to observe our bird population. She is a patron of conservation groups for many years, has taught and is still teaching public school children the value of conservation and the value of our outdoor, I would call them animals, but many of you probably call them critters. And she will also be having an interview and a PowerPoint presentation by Wendy on the value of conservation. My first question to you is this: how many of you have attended or have been in Los Angeles area? Los Angeles to San Diego? Is there a lot of open land in Los Angeles, between Los Angeles and San Diego? No. All the way through the hills you see homes. Okay, and that's what struck me about the Los Angeles areas compared to our northern Illinois, is the lack of open space. So I'd like to introduce Wendy Paulson, who is going to speak to us about the benefits of having open space. So let's give her applause.
Great. Okay, I tend to have a teacher's voice, so usually people can hear me without this, but is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
All right, good. And you probably wonder about that slide that's up there, which is very unnatural. But that's probably the benefits of conservation will get figured into this talk. But I thought, Eileen had told me that she kind of wanted to interview me about conservation, but I thought it would help to have some images, just to give us something to talk about. And I thought what I would do is, I always tell my kids not to assume anything, and sometimes I think I assume that people in Barrington know some of the great work going on here, and I'm not sure that's always the case. And the last few years have given some talks at the Aspen Ideas Festival, most recently at the World Congress of BirdLife International in Ottawa, Canada, about the citizen-led conservation movement in the Midwest, and particularly about Chicago wilderness, which is a term I'll use in this program. And actually there's no member of Chicago wilderness that is more exemplary, I think, than Citizens for Conservation, which is the conservation group here in Barrington. So even though, and I'm going to probably give this talk pretty much as I gave it to these other groups, just in the interest of time so that I don't get distracted and start talking about each slide. But I want you to know about Citizens for Conservation. We do have brochures up here, in case you don't know it that well. And also some flyers about the bird walks that I lead for CFC, which is the acronym for Citizens for Conservation. At the Ottawa talk, there was a great title up here, and I can't remember what it was. Somehow got erased. I think it was something like Chicago Wilderness Volunteers Restoring Native Grasslands, something like that. And I just simply wanted to give them a sense, that this is, even though it is a chock-full, concrete laden metropolis, that there is a vibrant conservation movement going on. And so I will begin with the same program that I've given elsewhere outside of Chicago, outside of Illinois, and just let you know that many of the slides, if not most of them, actually come from Barrington. So a lot of you in here, especially that are involved with Citizens for Conservation, will recognize people. So the talk is really to introduced people to a regional or a multi-local initiative to reclaim the biodiversity of the Chicago area. And as most of you know, the metropolis at the southwest bend of Lake Michigan was wilderness only 200 years ago. A mosaic of savannas, prairies, woodlands that hosted a rich diversity of species, including birds. What is left of those ecosystems has largely degraded. They've been fragmented, malnourished, developed, plowed up. The loss of habitat has meant the loss of species native to those habitats. Species like I can pause on some of these, the pale purple coneflower and the Tradescantia or spiderwort, or one of my favorites, the prairie lousewort, or pedicularis, I think is a much better name. There's been a precipitous decline in wildlife, especially grassland birds. But the irony and the opportunity is that the greatest biodiversity in our state persists in northeastern Illinois, largely on publicly owned land. In Cook County alone, the county that includes Chicago, nearly 70,000 acres, 11% of the county, have been protected. The challenge for conservationists is, how do we keep them from degrading even more? How can we recover biodiversity on the brink of extinction? Nearly 40 years ago, a movement started to reclaim, revive, and restore the nature that is unique to the Chicago region. The real engine has not been, however, public land managers or paid contractors, but an army of volunteers. Citizen conservationists who are empowered and committed to restoring as much of the region's biodiversity as they can. First efforts were modest in scale. The chief spark plug was Stephen Packard, founding director of Audubon Chicago region, who spent much of his time at Harvard in the 1960s organizing anti-war protesters. He used the same organizational skills to develop a volunteer stewardship network to do the brush cutting, seed harvesting, weeding, sowing, burning, and planting necessary to habitat recovery. The results were slow in coming, but the volunteers had faith and patience, and the plant communities began to respond. The grassroots effort attracted attention, including that of New York Times writer Bill Stevens. It was at that point, in the early 90s, that a larger, more comprehensive vision began to emerge that encompassed the entire Chicago region and ventured to imagine that engagement with nature should and could be a primary component of Chicagoland culture. The title Chicago Wilderness is used to describe the larger concept. It began as a consortium of 40 regional agencies and institutions that hammered out and endorsed common goals for the recovery of biodiversity in the area. That partnership has grown, I'm told now, to over 300 organizations. The time that I gave this last talk, it was over 240 that they add on every day. In addition, Chicago Wilderness pulled together and harmonized disparate educational initiatives such as Mighty Acorns and the Wild Things Conference held every 2 years. The one earlier this year attracted over 1,000 people to learn more, for example, about topics from sedge identification, to working effectively with public agencies, to protocols for monitoring birds and reptiles. The engine of this movement continues to be volunteers, a growing army of citizens who care, want to learn, want to help. The work is hard, it's messy, it's time-consuming. This is going to be happening just in a week or two, probably. But the results are satisfying and even stunning. The return of species has been especially thrilling. Species like the bobolink, who's on its, most of these are on their way to Argentina and Paraguay as we speak. And the eastern meadowlark, a bird that has declined by over 70% in grasslands. And the return of these species has given birth to a regiment of volunteer species monitors who take their assignments as seriously, probably even more so, than many paid land management staff. The reason it works and is being adopted by and adapted to other regions is that habitat recovery validates and harnesses people's natural capacity for discovery, love of learning, desire to help, optimism, sense of community. It uncorks the enormous potential of volunteer engagement. And in the case of several of the forest preserves, the revival of native grassland habitat has been so successful in attracting the associated nesting birds that 2 years ago they were named IBAs, or important bird areas. For me, and for everyone I know engaged in this ongoing restoration, some of whom are here in this room tonight, in a world of mostly depressing news for conservation, the story of Chicago wilderness and citizen restoration brings great hope. So that in a nutshell is, because this is a very condensed talk, because every time I had to give it, they said 5 minutes. So hopefully the images give you a sense. If you haven't been out on work days, there are plenty of people here tonight that have actually, that participate regularly in the work days that Citizens for Conservation holds, now 3 days a week. Am I right, Sam? Thursday mornings, Saturday mornings, and Sunday afternoons. Much of the year, it's 2 days a week, Thursday mornings and Saturday afternoons, and I think in the winter it gets down to Saturday mornings. But pretty much 52 weeks a year, and they amass thousands of volunteer hours. So with that, Eileen, I just wanted to get these images up to give us kind of a visual platform for a discussion, and you tell me what to do now.
Okay, we would open the floor for questions.
Oh, okay, and I didn't know if you had, because you were...
I wanted to ask you a question
Okay.
in reference to conservation. Is this movement spreading to the McHenry County? Because that area now the county is being threatened by massive development, with Algonquin going to Route 47, which was all farmland and...
I always considered 47 the line, and it's...
I do too,
Yeah.
and they're at 47. So has this been going on in that county to save some of the beautiful land there, or to preserve it as prairie?
Well, McHenry County has had its own volunteer, movement for years. Lake County does, DuPage County does, Kane County. This is a real regional, and that's why I said at the beginning, it's kind of a multi-local. I'm not, since I've been away for a while, I'm not as familiar with the McHenry County Conservation District and all their activities, but I know there is a big volunteer effort, and there may be others in this room that can answer that one better than I can. So, but it, as far as stopping development, probably no. But as far as attention to natural areas, and there's some wonderful ones in McHenry County. Glacial Park is one of the big ones. But there are plenty of others too, just on the other side of the Fox River and so forth. Yeah, okay. So any other questions?
Let me
Yeah.
just follow. So it's not that there's not a lot, so there, in your mind, you can always have more open spaces, but it's not that there's a shortage of open spaces. Is there a shortage of volunteers in all these other regions, or would you say in general, Northern Illinois is in pretty good shape that?
I think Northern Illinois is one of the brightest lights, actually, in our country, frankly. The Volunteer Stewardship Network, and I always mention Steve Packard's name in here, because I think it's important to give credit where credit's due, and he really did get this ball rolling in the late 70s, early 80s. And, depending on just how you count things, it's probably 6,000 to 8,000 volunteers in the Chicago region, and that's a pretty impressive number. Now, compared to the entire population, no, maybe not. But it's spreading, and Calumet, one of the most hammered industrially areas, has got a vibrant volunteer community. Field Museum is very active there in supporting, they especially have a kids group that I love called Kimby. It's Calumet is my backyard. And Open Lands has a lot of, a group called Wild Indigo, which is primarily African American group that is really trying to diversify the conservation movement, which I think all of those are very encouraging trends. It's never enough. I mean, I think, especially the people here that participate with Citizens for Conservation, say we'd always welcome more, we can always use more. But at the same time, I think it's pretty amazing on an 85, 90 degree, Thursday morning or Saturday morning in August, there are often 25 volunteers out there, either pulling invasive sweet clover or now it's more seed collecting and that kind of thing. I don't know how many people were last Saturday's seed collecting, but good numbers.
And then winter, they're out all day.
Winter is a whole nother thing. Winter is a wonderful time actually and it's probably for the real hardy, at least the beginning, but boy, there's no better way to warm up than cutting brush and hauling brush and throwing it on, and you see the coats just start peeling off, and pretty soon people are down to their shirt sleeves because they're doing a lot of hard, heavy work and building bonfires to get rid of the wood, and in the process clearing big areas that will be seeded, with seed that they've collected in the fall. So.
May I ask, when did you acquire the property across from Good Shepherd? When I was there some time ago, I saw all these houses, and I had my 2 children at Good Shepherd back in 1983 and 86. And it was out in the country, there was prairie, there were farms. It was so rural, it was so delightful. And then I went back for Art in the Barn about 5 or 6 years ago, and I see all these houses. Luckily, you have an area that has been preserved, and when was that area preserved, and how did you go about doing it?
Just celebrated 25th anniversary. So what's the math, Edith?
But that's 25 years of restoration. I think we had the property before that.
Okay,
So I'm thinking 80, I don't know, 85 or something.
I remember walking it with Wade Vanderpool and Tom Vanderpool, again, volunteers, and Wade always had his eye out for just what you're talking about, developable areas that really were worth saving. And just with very persistent, almost bulldog-like, persistent. He kept negotiating with the developers and managed the first parcel, I think was 15 acres or something like that, and it's just gradually added on, and even though, yes, there are some housing developments, there's Brookfield, is that right? East and west, and then Savannah, but we have now amassed, 80 to 100 acres? 131, wow, I mean, I've even lost the count. So it becomes part of the mosaic of the community, and the thing that's really terrific to me is that it kind of honors our natural neighbors. We tend to be very egocentric and think it's just us that matters, but there are all these birds and butterflies and frogs and snakes and toads and so forth that lived here long before we did, and just to be able to have a place for them, and as well as all the plants, which are exquisite when you get to know them. It's just great that that kind of citizen caring is going on. So, but it's been 25 years and more that particular. But Citizens for Conservation has done a remarkable job in the Barrington area. The Baker's Lake Savannah, next to Baker's Lake, is another project it's a place owned by the village of Barrington, but CFC really does the management and the restoration. And that place has one of the highest diversity of plant species of anywhere around. And it's also, you've got the lake, which is a wonderful bird watching area, and it's a real treasure right in the middle of town. Grigsby Prairie, out on Oak Knoll, thank you. Oak Knoll and Buckley. The CFC was the beneficiary of Peggy Richard's generosity. She gave nearly 50 acres of highly developable, highly valuable land to be transformed back into native prairie. And that's another place that's at least had its 25th anniversary, hasn't it?
Last
Yeah, last year, okay. And just this last week, third graders and fourth graders from all over the district have been going through that particular preserve and Flint Creek Savannah, so that this youngest generation will actually get to know what the ecosystem is that gave the state its name, the prairie state, because it's highly invisible. This famous statistic is that less than 1/100th of a percent of original prairie remains in the prairie state, which is not a very, not a statistic to be proud of. But with these restoration efforts, it actually is, while it's not the original, it's expanding, and which is something to be very glad about. This particular shot, I think, comes from Ginsburg Markham Prairie, south of the city, which is another spot, if you haven't been there, is really worth visiting. So I think that through the efforts of so many volunteer restorationists and conservation groups, some of them small, some of them larger, I think there's a potential for creating this mosaic within the Chicago region that does offer refuge to native plants and animals, and in the process give people a very rich dimension to living here.
In the other Chicago wild areas, do they welcome the school children or get them as involved as we do right here around Barrington? Because that seems really valuable to me, is getting the kids
It's super
involved.
important, Peggy. Yeah, it's super important. Open Lands does a lot in the city. In fact, I helped start a program there in the public schools called Birds in My Neighborhood to get kids out. And our next step, last year we did just an in-class presentations followed by a neighborhood walk. This year we're adding in a walk in a local forest preserve or park. But really just helping to familiarize children with their natural environments. I've always maintained that kids, in addition to learning their home address or street address, should learn right from the beginning the watershed that they come from, the ecosystem they come from, and who their wild neighbors are. I mean, that's something, if every politician knew that from the time they were this high, I think it would make a huge difference in the way we approach our planning.
So this is the inner city schools you're talking about?
Yeah.
And this is just like one day in the third grade, or?
It's between 2nd and 6th grade. I've tended to be in 4th grades mostly because I do 2 schools right now. But we have a whole cadre of volunteers, which I love because we put out an appeal for volunteers, and we got the response was a cross-section of age, race, gender, and occupation. It was just wonderful. So we've got retired Chicago policemen. We've got kids, very young people. They're willing to take a day off, every now and then and volunteer. And it's a jazz musician who travels around the world, but he's a huge bird expert. And so I mean, it's just a real mixture. And this last year was our first year, but we're continuing it.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I think there are a bunch of those type things going on. I know Winnetka on the North Shore has a nucleus of people very concentrated, very focused on getting children, particularly students, out into the natural world. One of the things that we're running into, I'm co-chairing the Cook County Next Century Commission. Because they're celebrating their 100th anniversary. And I've asked to be particularly involved in the education task force. One of the real hurdles we're facing right now is with all these, is it the core curriculum and that, testing requirements and all that, is a huge resistance from teachers to taking field trips, which blew me away when I heard that. I sat at a meeting down at Moraine Valley College, and there was attended by a lot of principals and superintendents, and they said, our teachers, they don't want to lose classroom time. I said, well, do they not realize that this is one of the best classrooms they could possibly have? I said, we've got a much deeper problem here. It's an educational problem. Fortunately, Barrington has recognized that nature is a fertile classroom, and is, has very much partnered with Citizens for Conservation in making sure that students get out into natural classrooms. But it's an issue that we all need to advocate for. Otherwise, we are going to raise ecologically illiterate citizens. And that'll have real ramifications in the way our communities develop, the types of communities that our children and grandchildren and succeeding generations will see. I mean, if they, so many people will talk about, oh gosh, I used to go and catch frogs in this particular place, and now there's no, it's just gone. And there are people here that have cared enough that they're making sure that there are those opportunities.
Yeah. That one sounds like a teacher training issue.
It is, but guess what? Teachers won't come to the training because they say we've got too much on our plate. That's what I heard from these superintendents. And
well, I'm inspired to say that by visits I've made to the Museum of Science and Industry, which has put together an outreach program for teachers, particularly in the elementary and up through junior high school level. They say that 90% of those teachers have no science training at all. And to change that, they've put together an organized training program which is attractive to the teachers. And presumably conservation could learn from that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I was kind of short-circuited that my mention of this Cook County Mech-Century Commission. One of the biggest challenges and biggest goals for this commission is to figure out how to engage citizens in a much better way, because I can't tell you how many times I go to forest preserves, locally or not locally and farther afield, where I'm the only person there. And there are a lot of people that are afraid to go to forest preserves. A lot of people that just don't know them, so they're just not quite sure, what to do. And so the last couple of years, the Cook County Forest Preserve education staff has said they've offered these training workshops, and the teachers don't come. So that's, it's going to take even a greater effort, and I think, again, volunteers are going to be part. I've actually advocated for developing a volunteer teaching corps that will really take the hand of teachers, much as we do here with the 3rd and 4th grades, but to help them see that these are marvelous places for learning, and they just stimulate the curiosity of kids and the sense of wonder and the sense of inquiry. It's just a place to begin asking questions, and that's what you want for lifelong learning. To me, there's no better place to really establish the building blocks for learning.
I do have a comment to make. Have you approached the high school, especially the honors program? We have a number of volunteers at our library, and they volunteer because they have to have so many volunteer hours for their honors program. This would be a marvelous program for those students to be involved in, because you're catching them when they're young, 3rd and 4th grade. But then eventually this leaves them when they're in high school. So perhaps something like this could, rekindle or renew their interest in preserving open land and conservation.
Well, volunteering at Citizens for Conservation is on the menu for community service, and we actually get a lot of kids. and and scout troops, but particularly in the summer, I was struck by how many high school students there were, and not just from Barrington, from other communities as well. And I remember working with one young man from Arlington Heights, I think, and I'd say, if I were in high school then, I probably would have said, "No, this is a nerd." You know, he was the most interesting kid once you started talking to him, and he had all these questions about, and then it turned out he happened to be a birder too, and I imagine he was probably embarrassed to admit that to his friends. Well, I let him know that I'm a birder too, and we got talking, and it was just so, and then he came back, he's come back several times, and so it offers a lot. And when I taught full-time in elementary school, I loved the kids that were often what other teachers considered fringe students. They just had, they had interests that were not like the sort of like mainstream, but often nature was what reached them. And so I think it's really important to have these opportunities for, and a lot of them are the most interesting kids around. You know, they just haven't had the outlets, and they haven't had the avenues in the traditional classroom.
I think
Eileen has some prepared questions.
I have to confess, I also gave these to Wendy. Okay, when you, we understand you graduated from Wellesley University with an English degree, and the question is, how did you become active in conservation and especially ornithology?
Well, I think that anybody that studies English gets acquainted with a lot of the poets, a lot of the, and people like, for me, the Romantic poets, Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley, were especially appealing, and they were all no strangers to nature, and that was probably my first inspiration. I loved, you know, just most school kids memorize, you know, I wandered lonely as a cloud, and all that. Their poetry, their reflections spoke to me. And I knew nothing about the natural world. I didn't know a cardinal from a robin when I was in college. And it's true. It was after college, although I spent a lot of time outdoors. I loved walking, I loved being outside. And it was after college that I met some people that were very interested in birds, and particularly actually in the peregrine falcon, that it was at the height of its decline because of DDT. And I had the privilege of going around with them when they were trying to find peregrine falcons to ban so that they could learn more about what was happening. And there weren't many falcons to see, but there were lots of other shorebirds and so forth, and I just soaked it up. And realized this is what I loved. And so then at the same time I was full-time teaching, I changed my whole curriculum at school. I mean, that's why I have very little patience with teachers today, because I knew nothing about this stuff. But I said with my second grade class, so let's learn about wildflowers, let's learn about birds. And I had the latitude for my school, I could take them outside whenever I wanted. They were just fine with that. And we got field guides, and we went outside and learned together. And I frankly think it's almost better if the teacher doesn't know the stuff, because you have to ask the questions. You're okay, and the kids often learn before you do, and that's great. They're teaching you, but they really experience, you know, what learning is. So anyway, that's kind of a short.
Okay, and when did you become that's what the time you became passionate about birds then, is when?
Yep, it was right. It was after college, and then once it began, I was living in Washington D.C. at the time, and there was a local Audubon Naturalist Society that had regular programs, and I went to all of them, and I just began learning as fast as I could.
And tell me about your efforts to restore the grasslands in Illinois forests preserves.
Well, I think you've seen a lot of that on the screen. Whoops.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Sorry about that. You know what, I'll just...
No, we'll put it here then. Okay, it's your turn, Jim.
Okay. Well, a lot of that's up there, but it was really, that was not a core activity at CFC when I began. Recycling was the main activity. In fact, I went around, I thought I was always going to be giving recycling presentations in schools and talking about garbage. It was really the Vanderpools that got that going. And Tom Vanderpool, who is kind of the guru and the Einstein of all the conservation effort, the restoration efforts here, really got things organized. He had a vision for restoring prairies and savannas and wetlands, and once I saw how much I could learn from him, that's when I got involved. And I continue to learn from him.
And could you please tell me what types of animals you have in your prairie lands? Are they do you have foxes, coyotes, chipmunks, or is it primarily birds, frogs, and things like that?
All of the above. So, it's pretty much everything. And I'm expecting that we'll probably get to the point where we even do some restoration of certain species. But particularly, I mean, the ones that are probably, one of the principles we operate on is if you build it, they'll come. And particularly with these grasslands, birds do tend to come back. When you get the floristic components, butterflies tend to come back if they're in the area. This particular prairie, Ginsberg-Markham, there has been a big effort to restore certain species of moths and butterflies. But in others, and I think maybe actually there too, some of the ground squirrels and so forth. I mean, in larger areas like Nachusa grasslands out south of Rockford, there is an initiative to restore bison that's going to start next year. So, and also, what?
They have them at Fermi.
At Fermi, they've got them, and then at Medewin, south of the city, that's going to begin too. So some of the larger, species, and I know that, in Wisconsin, wolves are beginning to be seen again. I would not, be surprised that in a few years you might see those. And right now we're almost overrun with coyotes. And I heard you just mention prairie chickens. That's been a tough one. Jasper and Pulaski counties down in central Illinois have been the only places they've kind of held on. They've been really difficult. And it's hugely due to habitat loss, and just the pressure of, not only having the reduced habitat, but then the predation as well. And so prairie chickens are a tough one.
What are prairie chickens?
They're a game bird, birds that are native to grasslands. We've got the greater prairie chicken, the lesser prairie chicken. They are extremely interesting birds. They have what they call booming grounds. So they're these leks, these communal leks, where the males do a booming display. And I spent an exceedingly cold morning April. It must have been below freezing. And at 3 o'clock in the morning is when we went out to get, and you hear this, and they're filling their air sacs, these pouches, these bright orange pouches. It was so neat to watch. And I think there's still some remnant populations in Wisconsin, and then farther west. But it's one of the great dramas that is very difficult to see these days. I just hope that someday there may be an expanded population of prairie chickens, but right now it's not looking so good.
What are the future plans for Citizens for Conservation? Are you going to try to acquire more land in our Barrington area, or go outside the county? Are you going to, work with people, I guess, who are doing that land? Is it land preservation or the land trust?
Well, and I should also mention that Citizens for Conservation is essentially a land trust too. I mean, they do the restoration, but they also hold conservation easements and so forth. But I think everyone has their antennae out looking for land, potential land to acquire. But also working with public agencies like the Cook County Forest Preserve, Lake County Forest Preserve, possibly McHenry County Forest Preserve, but always partnering with like-minded groups, and building a constituency for conservation. I think that's probably, and Sam, I don't know if you would add, Sam Oliver is the staff director, so I don't know.
You're exactly right. And we have recently acquired more property. And a lot of times we do it, we find property that is contiguous to pieces that we already have, and that makes it particularly valuable.
And I think the educational, effort is ongoing.
Now, how do you respond to those who say that land and species preservation is futile? Development and urbanization must occur to promote sustainable economic growth and population demands. And this is what I was told too as a young child when I saw the farms and the prairie lands torn up by bulldozers to build, housing. And it was very, distressing because these were areas where we used to play and run and, and pull Queen Anne's lace and some of the other things.
Well, that's really spoken out of ignorance, because we don't have a planet to sustain life. We're not gonna have any economy or any, and I often look at the Hispaniola. You look at Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and there's a line right down the middle. In Haiti, the natural resources have been hammered to the point of, they're just gone. And that, there's no sustainable economy whatsoever. And so that's sort of in stark terms. But I think, beyond, I think often when, in fact, a Scottishman that I met last year said to me, it's very simple, Wendy. He said, we were sitting at breakfast together, and he said, you have our water, our food, our air. Those are the three major needs. If we don't take care of those, then we're gone. And now he cares as much as I do about the frogs and the snakes and the birds and everything, but he said that is simple to understand. And what are we all doing to conserve those places and to assure that we have clean water to drink? We better have the forests and the wetlands to filter that water, to make sure that it's clean. That's probably the biggest environmental challenge that's going to face the next generation and the next few generations. And then the other dimension that I find the most compelling is, frankly, that yes, we are a major species on this planet, but we're not the only one. And I think that having the humility to recognize that there are all these wonderful creatures that enrich our lives and that make life just so much richer is just another thing, another reason to care about conservation. But I think, bottom line is, if we destroy the natural underpinnings of our planet, then we really don't have an economic future.
Wendy, would you please comment on how we can preserve wetlands? Now, I remember that there was a law, or actually developers were able to fill in wetlands decades ago. And then I remember reading the paper that developers could fill in a wetland if they could replace that wetland in another area. Now, I don't know what the law presently is, so could you comment on that?
Well, I'm no expert here, but it's what you're talking about is mitigation, wetland mitigation, and you can destroy one and then create. The recreation is never as good, although I have to say that Tom Vanderpool and CFC have done as good a job as I've ever seen at wetland restoration and wetland recreation. That's a flawed government policy, I think, and it's one that all of us, I think, there's so many levels you can work on in conservation. Restoration is one, but certainly policy changes are others, and I think our wetland policies have been pretty horrific over the years. So I just think to the extent that we can, contribute to making changes in those, it's better. But you look at some of the detention ponds along shopping centers, those qualify as wetlands. And you look at them, oh yeah, that they will count as wetland mitigation. And they might as well be paved over in most cases. I mean, they're almost, they're incredibly impoverished. There's usually no species of any critter that, maybe, some worms and whatever, but very little that should be in wetlands.
Thank you. What is your role in the Chicago-based Open Lands organization, and how do you promote ecological literacy? That's a term that you have used, and I find it very fascinating.
Okay, and I mentioned a little bit of, about Open Lands before, but I'm a board member there, as I've been a board member before at Citizens for Conservation, and I've started the bird program there. And I think in both places, or in any place that I work, the whole concept of ecological literacy is one that's really important to me. We have all kinds of literacy that we all as citizens of the country, I think, should have. You know, financial literacy, geographic literacy, civic literacy, scientific literacy. But I think ecological literacy is one that has been neglected enormously. And so it's just, as I said earlier, simply knowing what watershed you come from. I mean, some of the real simple things, you know, who your wild neighbors are, what ecosystem. Those are things that I didn't know as a kid. I had no idea, you know, that I was living on the floodplain of, you know, Eastern Virginia. I didn't know what that was. And so I just think that if we pay attention to that in our education system, that we're going to be preparing citizens to make much better decisions about future planning. I mean, development is going to happen, but it can always be done better. And if we're more informed, you know, we're going to be making better decisions. And don't feel you have to do the whole list.
Question here is there anyone in the Barrington area that you admire the most? And so why?
There's so many people I admire. I mean, good grief, there's plenty. And I really hate to single anybody out. But I do think it's worth saying that this community is full of leaders, you know, and shining examples of people who are involved in their community, who strive to make a difference. And that's one of the reasons that, because we left this area for a number of years, and one of the reasons I really wanted to come back, because I find it so stimulating, really, to be around those kinds of people.
To date, and I'm saying to date because I know you're going to accomplish other great things, but what is your greatest accomplishment? What are you proud of that you have worked on in the past? And what do you want to accomplish in the future in terms of conservation?
I mean, I did glance at these, and I saw that, and I said, I totally tried, I'm not sure about that one. I guess if I to see what I'm most proud about is actually working with groups like Citizens for Conservation, like Open Lands, like the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. I mean, that, you know, and being able to, along with many others, help make a positive difference, what you hope is a positive difference. And, you know, I think that's something that I hope, and I think every individual really wants to do. And that's really what I would say ahead. I don't have any great strategy for looking ahead, but look for opportunities to, you know, to make a contribution.
Now, I've noticed that, you know, you're basically in the grassroots of conservation. Do you have any plans perhaps for speaking with or promoting conservation with our local politicians or state politicians so that some of the laws that are hazardous to conservation could be changed? For example, like the wetlands area, and perhaps even requiring developers to leave some land that's open. And for example, that new initiative, Horizon Farms, that many years back, they were able to get an easement for conservation.
I don't let any opportunity go by when there are people that you know that are in positions of decision making, and whether it's with the Cook County Forest Preserve, whether it's you know with state legislators or national legislators. I mean, I happen to be able to. I spent a few years in Washington, and whenever I was with the Secretary of Interior, the Park Service head, I mean, always advocated. And I think that's what we all need to do. Whenever there's an opportunity, you do it. You know, the Octers are going to be doing. They've been active in some national parks recently, and I'm sure that they advocate for when they're out doing what they are with astronomy and so forth. So. it's, I just think that none of us has the luxury of just simply carping and wringing our hands, and then we all need to be doing what we can, whether it's writing letters, whether it's speaking to people, but just always looking for opportunities. I mean, I think of, Baker's Lake Savannah, just as a local sort of small example, but a really important example. School kids actually made a big difference there, because there was a campground before, the Methodist Church campground. There was some question about what was gonna be done, but it was, because of the way it had been managed, it actually has been a hotbed of wildflowers for a long time. It was just and I used to take kids from Huff Street School there on some of their field trips. And one week we went, and the kids were drawing shooting stars. I think we have pictures, Sam, of those children, and toothwort and so forth. And some of them came back that weekend with their parents, and the whole thing had been mowed. Well, they had a wonderful teacher who said, well, if this bothers you, let's write to the town, officials. And they did it. And that was just about the time that CFC was lobbying to get the management agreement. And that made a real difference. So it's just looking for those sorts of opportunities on any level. I mean, we're right now, my husband happens to be very active in China, and I'm going to be going to China in November and looking at wetlands there, because they're just, talk about degradation. It just, I mean, I get hammered. And I'm actually going to be with a 12-year-old Chinese girl who I met in Ottawa, where I last gave this talk. And she has become an accomplished birder, but also a very accomplished spokesperson and ambassador for conservation. And when I heard her speak, and she spoke to over 400 people in her second language, English, and was saying things like, ever since I've met them, I love these birds the same way my mother loves me, and I want to take care of them just like my mother takes care of me. And I said, this girl has a message that's really powerful, and she is totally fearless in giving it. And she has a mother that backs her up too, in a way. So again, that's an opportunity, and we're actually bringing her to speak with a mayor of a place next to a wetland. So that's a case of working with officials, because the officials, frankly, don't know what they have. I mean, they don't realize that these shorebirds, in that case, it's shorebirds that are using these wetlands on their way from Siberia down to their wintering grounds in Australia and New Zealand. They need nourishment along the way, and if they have nothing there, they're going to die, because they don't have what they need. So it's finding opportunities like that.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, for allowing us to speak with you in this community conversation. Do we have any questions from the audience? Any additional questions? Is there anything that you'd like to add for the community conversations? No?
No, I think it's fine.
All right, last question is then, if you're writing your memoir, what would you have as your impact?
It sounds like a eulogy or something.
No. So many people are writing memoirs now, describing very positive experiences, describing helping people in third world countries with various disabilities, or even going in and restoring an area. So what would you include? Would it be perhaps maybe to help the Chinese people to wake up, and I shouldn't say wake up, should be aware of their environmental degradation in terms of the air pollution, the destruction of plants and animals in terms of industrialization?
Yeah, that's okay. Because that's probably, I would say, maybe more didactic than I like to be. I guess I probably just, I think what I try to do is just help every individual that I meet, whether they're a city kid in Chicago, or a suburban kid in Barrington, or a child in China, just discover their own capacity for caring, for understanding the natural world, and hopefully to be motivated to do something to help conserve it, both for themselves and for others, you know. So.
Thank you, and if there's no further questions, we'll say, let's give a warm applause to Wendy for sharing her insights with us.